Okay, I did. Yeah, the Rules Committee will come to order. And today the committee will be considering two measures. The first is H.R. 1644, the Save the Internet Act. This bill would reverse the Trump FCC's disastrous 2017 vote that abolished net neutrality safeguards. Simply put, large corporations should not be in charge of deciding what Americans see online. They should not be allowed to block or slow down internet speeds or discriminate against content they don't like. A free and open internet is a critical part of enabling free speech and allowing our digital economy to thrive. H.R. 1644 mirrors the Bipartisan Congressional Review Act bill that passed the Senate last Congress and had 182 bipartisan signers here in the House. An overwhelming majority of Americans, 86% in a recent University of Maryland poll, are opposed to what the President's FCC has done. That includes 82% of Republicans. We should continue that bipartisan spirit this Congress and finally protect Americans from abusive practices by Internet service providers. The second measure is H.R. 2021, the Investing for the People Act. This bill would prevent deep and harmful cuts to discretionary programs established in the Budget Control Act. Without an agreement this year to lift these caps, non-defense discretionary funding will be cut by $54 billion. That would mean drastic cuts to public health, education, and social services programs like food and housing assistance. Our national security would also be negatively impacted since 1/3 of all investment in this area funds veterans programs, homeland security initiatives, diplomatic operations, foreign aid, and Justice Department activities. It is important to get the budget process started now to give Congress the guidance it needs to craft appropriation bills for FY 2020 so we can avert another harmful and costly government shutdown. But before we hear from our witnesses, let me turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he would like to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Tonight's hearing is yet another missed opportunity for the Democratic majority to work with Republicans to pass bipartisan legislation that will benefit all Americans. We're considering two bills. One is a Democratic takeover of the Internet, and the other is a Democratic proposal on budget caps. Both pieces of legislation could have been bipartisan and reflected solutions that both parties could be proud of. Instead, the majority has chosen to bring up two partisan bills that do not reflect the input of Republicans in the House. Moreover, neither of these bills stand a chance of becoming law. On the first bill, which we should really call the Democratic takeover of the Internet, Republicans were ready and willing to work with Democrats on bipartisan legislation to solve this problem. And common ground exists on the issue. Republicans do indeed believe in an open and free Internet, and we stand ready to work with our Democratic friends on legislation to prevent practices like throttling, blocking, and paid prioritization that would put an open and free Internet at risk. But Democrats are putting forward a wildly partisan and wildly over-inclusive bill that will impose a 1930s-era regulatory system on the modern Internet. There were other less heavy-handed and more bipartisan ways to solve this problem, Mr. Chairman, and I think the failure to do so today is yet another lost chance for us as a committee and for the institution of the U.S. House of Representatives. The second bill before us today concerns budget caps. As a former member of the Budget Committee, I know how important it is for the House to pass a budget each year. And let's be clear, this is not a budget. In fact, the Democratic-led Budget Committee didn't even attempt to write one this year. Unfortunately, the bill before us is incomplete and lacks vision for the long-term future. It sets budget caps for only the next 2 years, and it does not provide the type of 10-year plan for spending priorities and addressing the debt, which the committee traditionally writes each year as a budget. This bill makes no effort to offset spending, something Republicans did under every budget caps bill when we were in the majority. And it abdicates the responsibility of addressing the long-term drivers of our debt for our children and grandchildren. The annual budget process should provide the opportunity for both parties to work together, set spending limits, and address our long-term debt problem through reforms to mandatory spending. The Democratic majority is making no pretense of hitting any of these goals, making this yet another missed opportunity. We can and should do better than this, Mr. Chairman. When we return from the upcoming district weeks, I'm hopeful that the majority will decide to bring up bipartisan, bicameral pieces of legislation that will address major problems that need to be solved for the American people. As a reminder, this is divided government. If my friends are ever going to show that they can govern, They'll have to stop focusing on partisan bills to score political points and that amount to nothing more than show votes. There are plenty of areas where we can work together, and I would encourage the Democratic majority to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. And I just want to remind everybody that I think the most urgent budgetary issue facing Congress right now is the need to raise the statutory caps on discretionary spending, because if not, we're in for a disaster. And on the issue of net neutrality, I would just say to the gentleman that if I remember from the last Congress, after the Republican-controlled Senate actually passed something, we tried in this House to work with Republicans to get something up. We even filed a discharge petition, if I remember correctly. Mr. Doyle filed a discharge petition, and we couldn't get anybody on your side to want to work with us. So that is, I mean, so we are where we are, and we want to move forward. Again, you know, I would expect the Senate would take this up again, and we can work out differences in conference and hopefully have a final product that everybody could agree on. So at this point, I want to welcome Mr. Doyle and Mr. Latta. We are delighted to have you here, both from the Committee on Energy and Commerce. And anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. And I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for any opening remarks he may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to testify before the Rules Committee in support of H.R. 1644, the Save the Internet Act. This bill comes before the Rules Committee after much deliberation by the Energy and Commerce Committee. In total, the committee has considered this issue and this legislation for more than 18 hours over the course of hearings and markups since the beginning of this Congress. During that time, we've heard from consumer advocates, minority and underrepresented communities, rural broadband providers, small businesses, innovators, entrepreneurs, and millions of constituents, all calling for the restoration of net neutrality rules. In addition, polls show that more than 86% of all Americans, whether they be Republicans, independents, or Democrats, oppose the FCC's repeal of the protections that this bill reinstates. Mr. Chairman, people around the country care deeply about a free and open Internet because it's critical for so many communities and sectors of our economy. Today, broadband connectivity touches almost every aspect of our economy, politics, and culture. This legislation would restore popular, bipartisan, common-sense net neutrality protections and put a cop back on the beat to protect consumers, small businesses, and competitors from unjust and unreasonable practices by the Internet service providers. Second, this bill gives the FCC the authority to protect consumers now and in the future through forward-looking regulatory authority. Third, this bill restores FCC legal authority to support broadband access and deployment programs through the Universal Service Fund. These programs pay for the deployment of broadband in rural communities through the Connect America Fund and support access to working families, seniors, and veterans through the Lifeline program. At the same time, the legislation takes a light-touch approach towards the regulation of Internet service providers. The Save the Internet Act would codify the FCC's 2015 Open Internet Order and in doing so permanently prohibit the FCC from applying the provisions that require rate setting, requiring that broadband providers unbundle their networks, or levying additional taxes or fees on broadband access. That being said, I want it to be clear that I believe it's important that the FCC have the tools and the flexibility it needs to maintain a sustainable support mechanism for the Universal Service Fund, and I would hope my colleagues would continue to work with us to achieve that end in the future. Now, during consideration of this legislation, we made a number of changes to the bill as a result of discussions with the minority, which we believe strengthened the bill. The first change was the inclusion of clarifying language to make clear the intent of this legislation, that Congress is giving the FCC flexible, forward-looking authority to protect consumers from unjust, unreasonable, and discriminatory practices while permanently prohibiting the FCC from applying unnecessary provisions that require things like rate setting or mandating network unbundling. Second, at the suggestion of the minority, we added a temporary exemption that allows smaller ISPs more time to come into compliance with the 2015 Open Internet Orders Enhanced Transparency Rules. The legislation that you are considering here today charts a new course for net neutrality and would put in place 21st century rules for a 21st century Internet. I look forward to advancing this legislation to the floor and ultimately through Congress so that we can restore these essential protections for all Americans. I'm happy to answer any questions members of the committee may have regarding the bill, and I thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, you're recognized. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There we go. Again, thanks for having us this afternoon to testify on H.R. 1644. In very rapid succession, the majority's takeover of the Internet has been through a legislative hearing followed by a subcommittee and full committee markups on a party line vote. This rush process has left open several critical questions raised at the hearing and the markups about exactly how much authority this bill gives to the FCC, exactly what it may or may not prevent the FCC from doing in the future, and exactly what the impact of this heavy-handed approach will be on American innovation, investment, and our ability to close the digital divide. The majority is using the issue of net neutrality to jam through a Trojan horse. The net neutrality rules are simple and relatively easy to understand. No blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization. We have a strong bipartisan consensus to codify these rules. But every member of this committee needs to understand that fundamentally this bill is not a net neutrality bill. During this race to the floor, it has become clear that the real goal is not to legislate on net neutrality rules. Instead, the majority wants to invest the FCC with sweeping powers of Title II to regulate every aspect of the broadband Internet service. They want the government to have the power to tax the Internet, take control of private networks, or even regulate speech online. We offered amendments of full committee to close the doors to these and other powers that are enabled by this bill, yet completely unrelated to net neutrality. They were rejected. We offered an amendment to prevent the FCC from enforcing the 700 rules the majority claims to be forbearing from. It was rejected. We offered an amendment protecting the next generation of wireless networks, 5G, from this draconian regime that is incompatible with the network slicing technology needed to realize the promise of 5G. That too was rejected. And most shockingly, the majority even rejected an amendment that was passed unanimously by the House in the last two Congresses to relieve our smallest rural Internet service providers from some of the most burdensome reporting requirements of the FCC's 2015 order. Yes, they walked away from a bipartisan deal they had negotiated with us and passed twice already. I filed two amendments to be considered for the floor that will help address some of these concerns with H.R. 1644, and this committee should make them in order. But I hope we can keep in mind that it doesn't have to be this way. Republicans introduced three real net neutrality bills before the majority dropped H.R. 1644 and made it clear for them it is all of Title II or nothing. For example, my bill is borrowed from a draft proposed by the last Democratic chairman of the ENC, Henry Waxman, back when Democrats understood that you don't need to take over the Internet to write a net neutrality bill. How can you say that Henry Waxman's bill is not a real net neutrality? Republicans on ENC stand ready to work with our colleagues to protect consumers on the basis of our bipartisan consensus on net neutrality rules. But net neutrality is not Title II, and net neutrality does not need Title II. All it needs is a Congress willing to work together on a solution. And again, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you both being here. I have no questions. Mr. Hastings?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. Mr. Doyle, Mr. Latta indicated in his testimony that he introduced two bills. Was it two or three? And I'm not quibbling, it's three bills. And he referred to them as my bills, meaning his bills. Did he discuss with you the three bills?
Thank you, Mr. Hastings. The first time we found out about the three bills that the Republicans Drop was the day of the first hearing. We had no prior notice that they were dropping bills. We had no contact from the Republicans indicating that they wanted to sit down and work on this legislation with us. So it was sort of a surprise the day of the first hearing that these three bills were dropped, and that's the first we knew about them.
It's sort of a hackneyed phrase, but it takes two to tango. And I consider always each side, we blame the other for not being bipartisan. But if no one approaches you, and I would think the way Mr. Lauder approached it by indicating that it was my bill, meaning his, which he's entitled to, but at the very same time, if it was to be bipartisan, it would seem to me with you in the majority that you would have been contacted, just as when you were in the minority, if you sought something from the majority, you would have contacted them. That's how I think things ought to go, but then I've been mystified for a long time here. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask my questions, I'd ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the statement of administration policy on H.R. 1644.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, but let me quote a couple of things from that statement, if I may. First, since the new rule, quote, since the new rule was adopted in 2018, consumers have benefited from a greater than 35% increase in average fixed broadband download speeds, and the United States rose to 6th from 13th in the world for these speeds. In 2018, fiber was also made available to more new homes than in any previous year, and capital investment by the nation's top 6 internet service providers increased by $2.3 billion. That suggests to me, frankly, an approach that's working. The SAP goes on to say that quote, H.R. 1644 would tie the hands of the Commission in the future and prevent the agency from evolving its rules to adapt for emerging technology. So again, I think important considerations as we go forward. Let me ask you, because we did get obviously two very different versions or views of how bipartisan this was. So, Mr. Lalla, let me ask you this. Was there any meaningful outreach or discussion back and forth in your view?
Well, Mr. Doyle and I had a conversation that I reached out and said that the Republicans are willing to work together to come up with net neutrality, that the legislation that we had introduced, my bill in particular, was Mr. Waxman's bill when he was chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, that showed no throttling, no blocking, no paid prioritization, that he also specifically said no Title II. We also have the current chair of the committee, Mr. Pallone, and his statement from back then, looking at those same issues and not looking at the Title II provisions that you'd have. So, when you look at the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Morris Rogers' legislation, that was legislation that came out of the State House, the Democrat State House, signed by the governor, a former member of the House, that showed that they worked together out there to get this through, and that's a piece of legislation she did. And then the ranker, Mr. Walden, had his legislation. And again, it was making sure that we, have those in place, that we don't have the throttling, the blocking, the paid prioritization out there. So, we want to work together with our friends on the other side of the aisle because, again, as in your opening statement, I don't think this bill is going to have a chance. But if we want to see something happen, we need to work together now to get it done.
So then I want to give my friend, the chairman, a chance to respond if he chooses to.
Well, I don't dispute that they dropped 3 bills. They just dropped them the day of the hearing, and we didn't know about it in advance. I've been on the committee for 17 years now, most of it in the minority, and I have been a part of sponsoring legislation with my Republican friends during that time when I was in the minority. I always had to go to them, and generally, if I had an idea or an amendment they agreed with, it would then be given to a member of the majority, and I would be the Democratic sponsor of that amendment, and that's how we proceeded. The Energy and Commerce Committee is a fairly bipartisan committee, and I think we try when possible to be bipartisan. That wasn't how this worked. No one came to us. No one said, hey, we'd like to share a different approach. We found out about it the day of the first hearing.
Well, certainly, all the good ideas aren't from either side of the aisle, so let me ask you this. I understand there's 31 Democrats on the bill, and I'll pose this question to both of you. Were there any meaningful Democratic amendments to this product?
I think there was one that was offered, if I recall correctly, was on the small business, and is that, I think that was the only one.
One on forbearance.
Oh, and forbearance, oh, and that, but all of the Republican amendments were did not go anywhere. I offered mine, and that didn't go anywhere. But I think it's what we're seeing is that we're going to let the FCC being out there writing the rules, and it should be Congress, and that's what I think the people out there want to have is Congress setting it into legislation and not the FCC. So I think that when we look at what's happened out there, that again, as I said, that we on our side are very willing to work on this. But when you're looking at the Title II, it's not going to be going anywhere in the Senate. But I think we can get things done on looking at the other areas that people really have a concern on.
Mr. Chairman?
I would just say, Mr. Cole, that I've offered many wonderful amendments as a member of the minority on the Energy and Commerce Committee that the majority decided that they didn't want to pass. I understand how it works. I'm sorry that we didn't find any of their amendments, the kind of amendments that we felt we could support at this time. But we did take some notice of concerns they expressed on forbearance and on the small business exemption, and we incorporated those into two Democratic amendments in an attempt to reach out to the minority and say, we hear your concerns and we're trying to address them.
But there were no meaningful amendments from your own side? I mean, is this bill that good?
There were two amendments, one on forbearance and one on the small business exemption that we offered, and we did that by listening to some of the concerns we heard from the minority.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Latta, this question. The term net neutrality has been used by both Republicans and Democrats alike, but they often have very different contexts. And the key voice in this debate, as one of them, what is your definition of net neutrality?
Well, right off the bat, you want an open and free internet. That's what you want to make sure is out there. You also want to make sure, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, that you don't have the throttling, the blocking, the paid prioritization. And that's when I think that when you talk to people out in the public, that's what they're thinking of. They don't want to have this happening. I don't think people out there want to see that you have an overbearing FCC come in that you don't know what they're going to come up with, and you really want to have the Congress writing the rules.
Just to ask, and I'll pose both of you if you like, but not all of us are as well versed as the two of you are on this rather complex topic. So if you could tell me what the terms throttling, blocking, and prioritization mean to each one of you.
So think of the internet service providers as the middleman. They sit here, right? Consumers over here, content providers over here. The whole idea of net neutrality is having a process where consumers can get to the content they want to see without that middleman blocking them from being able to do it. And on the content side, people that have content that they want to get to consumers or products, that doesn't get blocked by the ISPs. I'll give you an example of blocking. AT&T had a mapping service on their phone service. It was $5 a month. Then Google come out with a free mapping service. AT&T blocked Google's free mapping service on their phone, on their system, because it was competing with their app that they were charging $5 a month for. That's blocking. That's something we don't allow anymore. Throttling is degrading a service. A good example of that would have been Netflix. And of course, paid prioritization is where someone pays more money for, to get their product through one way or the other way faster than everyone else. You can see the implications that would have for innovation, where the next great idea of some small entrepreneur in a garage trying to compete with a large established corporation of getting their product from this side over to this side because they don't have the money to pay for priority service. Those are the three bright lines that, by the way, we all agree on. Democrats and Republicans agree on the process of no blocking, no throttling, and no paid prioritization. That's not where the argument is.
And that's in the bill?
Well,
Or-
there's one thing, if I could just follow up on that, if I may. That when you're looking at, this bill is dealing with ISPs, the internet service providers out there. This bill does not deal with what we call the edge providers out there. That's your Google, your Facebook, your Twitter. And so the bill does nothing on that end. And so when people have been seeing things on the news in the last year, it's on the edge side, not on the ISP side.
Do you offer amendments to deal with those issues?
If I remember, we had, Mr. Walden had talked in committee, but I can't remember if there was an amendment offered.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your responses.
I'm sorry, he offered and withdrew, I'm sorry, offered and withdrew.
Okay. Then I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Torres.
Just a quick question regarding 911 services. Most landlines are gone by the wayside. Most people have either a cell phone, or if they do have a landline, is voice over internet. So it's a internet service provider that is providing 911 services. When it comes to, when we talk about throttling, how does that impact the delivery of a 911 call?
How does it impact the telephone call? Is that what you're saying? I don't know that it does. Throttling, as we're defining it on the internet, would degrade a service that's coming on the internet. Someone
So
trying
degrading
to.
a service could be degrading the delivery of a 911 call, which needs to be protected to ensure that it's delivered to the PSAP.
I'm not sure that applies to telephone.
Okay, are you referring to a situation like where there'd be, that call would gain like over other calls at that time? Because, we want to make sure that in some cases you've got a presumption out there that emergency calls could take priority and make sure that those calls can make
If we're all using the
through.
internet, and I'm using the internet to make phone calls, and one of those phone calls is to, a 911 center, versus someone using the same service to purchase, a new car or, realtor services. Is my 911 call going to be degraded because, we want that business call to get ahead?
Well, and again, we want to make sure is that those calls on the emergency side do have the ability to rise to the top, because we want to make sure that the responders out there can get there. So it's making sure that that happens.
So from my perspective, when we talk about protecting internet services and when we talk about ensuring that there is a system that is affordable, there is a system that is not going to be compromised simply because some, the haves and the have-nots. I want to make sure that it is a system that everyone can participate in, regardless of how much you're able to pay. So I support this legislation. I'm really happy that it's moving forward. Of all of the bills that we see here in Congress, this is the one issue that my constituents are very concerned about. I have a large problem with homelessness. When people are applying for jobs, when people are applying to go to college, for example, if they're not able to get online and fill up those applications because the library is closed and they're having to utilize their cell phones and they're constantly losing signal because it's not a reliable network, that's a cause for concern. So I want to make sure that we do everything that we can to ensure that we protect services for them.
That's why the Lifeline program is so important, and this bill also restores the legal underpinnings. When Chairman Pai threw out the 2015 Open Internet Order, those went out with them. This bill restores those legal underpinnings for Lifeline and Connect America, and you're talking about services that for our veterans, our seniors, and for the poor. That's very important, and that's restored in this bill.
And protecting Lifeline is critically important, but ensuring that telephone companies also don't utilize this program as a way to offer, a cost savings plan at this rate, where the person who would be applying or would be utilizing the Lifeline program is capped out at a certain amount. So we want to make sure that we protect the pricing for those users, and that is not a grant program that could be utilized for a higher program.
Thank you. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you both being here. I tell folks back home, best part of my job is that the subject matter experts come up to the Rules Committee every Monday afternoon, and I get a private tutoring session on what's going on. And I get to respond to all the internet myths that have been mailed to me all weekend long about whatever the process is. And I've got one, and I hope you can set me straight. One of my constituents wrote in and said, Rob, is it true that the House is getting ready to use a 1930s piece of legislation designed to regulate telephone monopolies and apply that to the 21st century internet in the name of promoting innovation? Is that true?
One of your constituents wrote you that, huh?
You should see the folks back home that I have.
I have a little skepticism about that.
You should see them.
That's not true. And the reason that's not true is all the parts of Title II that applied to the old Ma Bell and telephone, those were all the provisions of Title II that were forbeared in the bill permanently. So none of this 1930s Ma Bell brick telephone that we hear about so much is really part of this bill anymore. Those are the sections that have been forbeared, and they've been forborne permanently.
Mr. Ladd, is that...
Well, this is where we have a difference of opinion, because up until a few years ago, FCC commissioners, chairman, they all saw what you're looking at with the internet as an information service and not a telecommunications service. And so not under Title II. And at the same time, when you go back to the 96 Act, what really wanted to make sure that more money was going to be out there, that things were going to really proliferate for the better for the consumer, is to make sure you had a very, internet that was not going to be under Title II. By putting it under Title II, then you're putting it under the restrictions from, the 34 Act, which is then, of course, you're going back to the days of Ma Bell and all those when you're looking at on the monopoly side. And that's not what the internet is. It's an information service and not a telecommunications service. So it really comes down to that again, we want to make sure that it remains open, that folks have the ability to, get on there, to innovate. And again, that's what's grown the internet. It's not the government. It's been on the private side. And so we want to make sure that continues. And, when we're talking about the forbearance, and I'm not sure if it's been circulated yet, but if it hasn't, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that it is. This is a Congressional Research Service dated April the 2nd. And it's really dealing with the questions on the forbearance of the 700 areas.
Objection.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But just to, again, we have disagreement again on where we are on this right now, but it says for reasons discussed in more detail below, the memorandum concludes the review in court would appear likely to uphold an FCC interpretation that H.R. 1644 does not abrogate the FCC's authority to revisit prior forbearance determinations, including those made in the 2015 order. So again, we want to make sure that we go back to where we saw commissions, Republican and Democrat, saying that this is an information service that's being provided out there.
Now, all I have, Mr. Ladd, is just these 4 pages of the Rules Committee print. Where is that list of the 700 some odd provisions that one expected to be applied, but now through the committee's benevolence are not going to be applied?
Well, thank you. And what we've asked is that we could get those 700. Those have not been given to us. And one of my amendments is asking that, that no later than 3 days after the date of the enactment of the act, that the 700 rules or regulations referred to in paragraphs 5 and 37 of the report, are provided to us. And so we don't have those.
But there would be no reason not to provide those, is there, Mr. Chairman?
Let me say this. 2 things. The CRS report that you just put into the record does not apply to the bill that's before you. That applied to a previous version of the bill, and the bill has since been amended to address some of the concerns on forbearance, and there is no CRS report on this bill that's before you right now. So what's in the record does not apply to the bill before you. Secondly, find it rather interesting. This is my 25th year in Congress. I never knew that we legislated based on what bills don't do, but rather on what they do. We have been talking all along about what this bill does and how it affects ISPs and how it affects consumers and those protections. The fact that over 700 regulations that were formerly part of Title II are no longer in this bill. They've been forborne. And someone has, apparently, this has been referenced, by the way, not only in the 2015 order, but amongst FCC staff and amongst Mr. Latta in a statement he made back in February where he said there's over 700 regulations for bear. So now the question is, apparently the FCC never compiled the list because I don't think anybody was too much worried about what didn't apply anymore, what wasn't in law anymore, what they didn't have to worry about anymore. Seems a kind of a silly thing, but I have no problem at some date if the FCC wants to sit down and compile the 700 regulations that no longer have anything to do with this legislation or Title II. Let them have at it. I don't care about that. But just to be clear, it's really a non-issue in terms of the effect of this bill.
I think from my constituents' perspective, it's that the internet is the goose that's laying the golden egg, particularly all across rural Georgia, where we're connecting folks who've never been connected, offering economic opportunities that have never been offered before. And I don't know how it is back home for you, but I'm from the federal government. I'm here to help in an area of high innovation and emerging technologies. Doesn't fly so well back home. So those regulations that are not going to apply from the 1930s Ma Bell days, meaningful to folks back home. Now, what I have heard, thinking about what the bill does do, is from a lot of folks worried about the search engines you mentioned earlier, Mr. Latta. Folks worried about we've seen the stories about conservative content getting pushed down, about folks being silenced because people didn't like the content of their free speech. I think in the monopolistic environment that some of those services are rolling into these days, there may be a role for regulation. What does this bill do to protect folks from being silenced, as we have read stories? What does it do to deal with those service providers on the search engine side, for the Twitters, for the Facebooks of the world?
The edge providers. This bill's narrowly focused on ISPs because they're the gatekeepers to the internet. They control the networks and they have the ability to shape and control traffic. The FCC has no authority over edge providers or expertise in this matter. They're regulated over at the FTC. So I'm sympathetic to some of the things that have been said about edge providers and the need to maybe look into that. But that's another issue for another day. It doesn't belong in this bill, but I am looking forward and happy to work with my friends on the other side of the aisle on looking at edge providers at a future date. It's just not something that belongs in this bill.
Well, if I could
Please,
comment again, I'm sorry, if I may. Again, as I mentioned earlier, when you're looking at your edge providers out there, and that's where we're hearing the concern from. It's from, who's doing the blocking, who's doing the throttling, who's doing the paid prioritization out there. It's not coming from the ISPs, which this bill has the control over. It's on the edge providers, which is, again, your Google, your Twitter, and your Facebook. And so that's why we think it's very, very important that you do look at it in this, because you got to see where it's happening. I know that Dr. Burgess has an amendment, I believe, that has a very holistic approach on it.
I know we've been talking about this issue for what seems like my entire 8 years in Congress in one fashion or another. I believe the Energy and Commerce Committee has as many talented folks as we have anywhere in Congress to sort this out. I recognize what the chairman is saying when he says he expects folks to come to him, because that's what folks do when folks have gravitated to power. Perhaps that's why I hear the things I hear from my constituency back home. Hey, they did it that way, so we're going to do it that way. My constituency believes we can probably all do it a little bit better, and I hope that they're right. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And to the chairman, I would just say, in the suburbs of Denver, I've gotten complaints about throttling and blocking and concerns about, different things happening to folks as they enjoy the internet in one form or another. So I appreciate this bill coming forward. It certainly is something that comes up, town halls and phone calls and all that stuff. But I do have a question. So Mr. Cole raised the statement of administration policy that we just received. And there is the paragraph, and he quoted it, since the new rule was adopted in 2018, consumers have benefited from a greater than 35% increase in average fixed broadband download speeds, all that sort of stuff. I mean, how do you respond to this statement from the White House?
Let me say this, there's no relationship between net neutrality rules and the things that they talk about. There's conflicting reports, and this is another area where we disagree. When the 2015 Open Internet Order was put through, investment actually increased in these services, and when Chairman Pai repealed the 2015 order, investment actually decreased. Now, I think the real tell is, what do the ISPs say, not when they come to Congress, but what do they say when they go to Wall Street and talk to their investors? And what they've said during 2015 Open Internet Order is that order did nothing to stifle their investments in the internet, and they were going full steam ahead, and they didn't see, what companies want is certainty. When they know what the rules are, then they just have to play by the rules. That's what they look at. Uncertainty is what causes companies to hold back. So this idea that somehow the 2015 order stifled investment, it's not true. And certainly the companies, if you read their statements when they sit in front of their investors in Wall Street, said as much in writing.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Latta, just a comment, and Mr. Cole and you both used words, this was rushed, this is jammed through. I got to tell you, every single bill that has come to this committee, and I'm going to keep repeating it as long as you guys keep repeating the same thing about how everything has been so rushed. But every single bill has been rushed, including at least one appropriations bill that was passed last September that was brought forward, and everybody says, it's too rushed. We haven't had enough time to debate this thing. So I don't know whether 18 hours is a good number. I don't know whether you were given a fair chance to speak on behalf of your particular amendments, but this is clearly a theme that we hear with every single bill. And I'll let you respond to that if you like, but I'm just telling you, you might as well just get a standard piece of paper, say, this was rushed through, we didn't have a chance, this isn't fair.
Well, if I may, thanks very much for the question. And again, this is very important to the American people, and it's been discussed for quite a while, and we want to make sure that it's done right. Because, and on our side, again, we truly believe that if you're going to be looking at this in a whole manner, you need to look at everybody who's involved in this out there. And we don't have all the players at the table, as been mentioned. And so to do this bill right, that's why I think you need to do that. And so the question becomes, is as it goes over to the Senate, what are they going to do to it? And again, we want to have legislation that the American people want, and I think we can work on that and get it done.
Well, I would assume this gets out of the House, goes to the Senate. If they choose to pick it up and send back to us what they sent us last year, that would be very interesting. If they choose just to sit on it, then that's what they'll do. But at some point, we want to move these things. And obviously, I don't want you to feel like, Mr. Doyle has stopped you, has muzzled you from speaking, which I don't think he has done. And I don't think that's happened.
He's a friend.
And I don't think that's happened in any case. But I'm just speaking as one member of this committee that I can tell you, we've heard probably a dozen times now how rushed everything is. And so with that, I'd yield back to the chair.
We didn't hear that when the tax bill came before here, and it didn't go through Ways and Means, but that's another topic. Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. We did have a lengthy and lively markup in full committee last week. much of it's still fresh in my mind. I always marvel at the sophistication of the constituents that Mr. Woodall is blessed to represent. But for those constituents in the country who are not as sophisticated, Mr. Lotta, perhaps you could give us just a few words on this issue of forbearance. And for many people, this is a new term. So could you perhaps tell us what we think forbearance means and why it's important?
And again, what we're looking at is for the FCC not taking an action. There would be, like there would be X number of regulations out there that say, well, we're going to forbear, we're not going to go forward on. But again, and this is where we have a disagreement, that what we saw from the CRS report, and that what we're looking at is that the FCC could later not forbear on those and go forward. Yeah, because that's what CRS has said. So it's saying that you cannot go forward on something and they're going to forbear on an action.
So, Mr. Doyle, it was your opinion that this CRS report, I do have a copy of it, is no longer part of the discussion because of changes that were made in 1644?
That's correct. We added new forbearance language at full committee, and the key word, I think, is the word permanent. The amendment says that the...
Is permanent used before or after the term forbearance?
Permanent forbearance. As of the day of, I don't remember the date, when it was done. Permanent means permanent, which means that no future FCC can go back and unforbear what we have put into statute as permanent.
Well, let me just, specifically in the CRS report on page 7, second paragraph, in contrast to prior statutes, H.R. 1644 does not explicitly prohibit Federal Communications Commission from rescinding the 2015 order or revising any of the determinations it made in that order. Rather, it simply restores the order as it was in effect January 19, 2017. And then they go on to say, given that Congress knows how to explicitly prohibit agencies from revising rules, H.R. 1644's departure from the explicitness of other statutes suggests that H.R. 1644 does not in fact prohibit the FCC from revising determinations. So you think you fixed that, even though the Congressional Research Service says, given that Congress knows how to explicitly prohibit, we know this because we do appropriations bills sometimes, and we have limitation amendments in appropriations bills. We all know what that looks like. We've all done it for our favorite things, that whether it be light bulbs or cattle feed. We all know how to prohibit things in appropriations bills. So you're saying that would not be possible going forward with the language that you have provided in 1644?
That's correct. We feel that the language that we provided in the amendment, and I'll just read it to you, with respect to the declaratory ruling and order described in subsection B1 to permanently reinstate the rules and legal interpretations set forth in such declaratory ruling and order. I believe the key word here is permanently. I think that's a very clear term, and it clearly states the intent of this bill and the intent in Congress, and that's why we think that it has addressed the concerns expressed by you and others on the committee, as well as the CRS report.
But notwithstanding any other portion of this bill, no funds shall be expended for, fill in the blank. I mean, we know those amendments are likely to be offered during the appropriations process, and you think that language in the underlying bill would prohibit a limitation amendment in an appropriations bill? I would not be as confident about that.
Well, we feel confident about the language. I know attorneys can disagree. All you got to do is give attorney a fee, and they'll disagree with anything you put into law, but we think the language is pretty tight.
So, again, we're going to have to agree to disagree on that. Mr. Lotta, you referenced Ranking Member Walden's amendment on the internet ecosystem, and that was an amendment that I don't recall whether it was rejected or he withdrew it because of the point of order that was issued at the time that the amendment was offered, and the point of order was going to be on the germaneness of the amendment.
And I believe he withdrew the amendment.
You what?
He withdrew the amendment then.
But he withdrew it because of the
Right,
point of order as
right,
to
after the point of order,
germaneness.
correct.
And I don't remember if it was on that point of order or some other point of order. I pointed out that the bill will come to the all-powerful House Committee on Rules, where we have the ability to waive all points of order. We do it as a matter of routine up here. So if that amendment were offered, would you be supportive of that amendment, even if it required a waiving of a point of order?
Again, if you're going to have a piece of legislation that the American people want and what it's going to cover, that you need to take in all the parties out there. You just can't look at one part and not the whole, because again, it's where the people have seen from the Twitter, the Facebook, and the Google, where those other issues arise from.
Correct. I think we've all wondered about that because we've searched for something on Google and, well, I didn't mean to say Google. We've searched for something on a search engine. I don't want to upset them. We searched for something on a search engine, and then we got all kinds of ads on the side of our Drudge Report about things that we've recently searched for. So clearly, the edge providers are making a value-based decision on the content that they think I'd like to see in the ads. That's not the internet service provider who's making that determination. That is the edge provider. Is that not correct?
Correct.
And it would be reasonable to do a study to look at the effect that that's having on internet usage and consumption. That,
I would say so.
so Mr. Doyle, I likely will offer that amendment, and
I would just say to
we'll get a
the,
chance to, I don't know whether the chairman will make it in order or not, but it may be something we get to see on the floor.
I would just say to the gentleman that I think these are things we need to talk about. The idea of a study at GAO to look into these things is I don't think, a bad idea. And like I said, you know, the edge providers are a different animal. They're not regulated by FCC. That's not their area of expertise, and they don't have the authority to regulate them. I would note that a lot of what we hear from Republicans is they'd like to send the authority for regulation, so-called cop on the beat, for ISPs to the FTC. I would submit to you, not only that the FTC has said publicly they can't do that, they don't have the manpower or the expertise, but let's look at the job they're doing right now policing the edge providers. I would say that none of us are very happy with what we're seeing from some of these edge providers, and I would say to the gentleman that you know, it's not something that belongs in this bill, but I think it's certainly something that we should be talking about in the future and working together on.
You know, my predecessor in this office, and you served with him, I remember him giving a talk in Dallas in the late 1990s. The economy was really strong, much as it is now, and the reason for that economy or that economic boom that was being seen at the time was felt to be that was the dot-com bubble, or that was the e-commerce effect. And I remember Mr. Army in his discussions, he says this has happened. People in Washington don't understand why it has happened, but it's so typical when Washington doesn't understand why something is happening, the next effort will be to tax it and regulate it, and when you do, it is over. So those words have stuck with me all these many years, and although I'm now the representative from that part of North Texas, I think those were words of wisdom spoken in the late 1990s, and they're probably wise today. Mr. Latta, you were asked a question by Ms. Torres, and I heard the question. I'm not sure if I understood the answer, but it was the issue around a service provider to prioritize emergency transmissions. And is that something that you feel is sufficiently protected in the bill that we have before us today?
Yeah, because again, thank you for the question. We want to make sure that when these 911 calls go out, that there's a priority on those. I know through the years that we've had different discussions, not dealing with net neutrality in committee, but making sure that when you have an emergency out there, and we're looking at going forward with FirstNet has been talked about in the last several years, and where we're going with that, that we want to make sure that there's a priority given, that you could have in an emergency, these calls and things going over the internet, getting that priority. So we want to make sure that that's done. I can't really say that in the legislation that it does do that.
Oh, so, okay, so you can't say that that's done in the legislation.
It is protected in the legislation. I'll read you the section 819A of the rules restored say nothing in this part supersedes any obligation or authorization of a provider of broadband internet service, access service may have to address the needs of emergency communications or law enforcement, public safety, or national security authorities consistent with or as permitted by applicable law or limits the provider's ability to do so. So that's protected in the bill.
Very well. We'll leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raskin. And let me just remind members, we have another panel as well, so I don't want to discourage you from asking questions, so, but I kind of do. No, I don't. No.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Joy, I just want to salute you on your great leadership of this legislation. I'm thrilled that you've been able to vindicate the three basic principles for a free and fair internet of no blocking, no throttling, and no paid subsidization to distort what goes on the internet for I think they call it prioritization, no subsidized prioritization. And you've empowered the FCC to stop other kinds of unfair, unjust, and discriminatory practices that are taking place. And that's why it's fantastically popular legislation. In fact, it's the first bill that I've ever been lobbied on by all of my children and nieces and nephews. I'll say, you've got to support the Save the Internet Act. But I just have one question for you, which is, in the time since the FCC took away the 2015 Open Internet order, what kinds of troubling things have taken place that would suggest we really do need this urgently?
Yeah, and I think you're hitting the key difference between Republicans and Democrats on this issue. We all agree to no blocking, no throttling, or no pay prioritization. There's no disagreement about that. The question is, what type of unjust or unreasonable or discriminatory behavior may happen in the future that we haven't even envisioned yet? So it's sort of like if we just do those three things, it's like locking your front door of your house but leaving your back door open. And that's why we need to give the FCC the cop on the beat to look at future behavior that may be unjust or unreasonable or discriminatory and have the power to address those consumer complaints. We already are looking at things like zero rating and interconnection points as possibilities where there could be discriminatory behavior. Not in all cases, and in that case, the FCC can look at these things on a case-by-case basis. But if we just agree to do these three things and nothing else, then we've not done our job. We just basically say, okay, the stuff we all know about and agree to, we're going to stop that stuff. But anything that happens from this point on, there's no cop on the beat. I think that's the big difference.
Great. And I just finally, you also promote the power of the FCC to push broadband in rural communities and poor communities, and so I was delighted to see that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a statement by Congresswoman Maxine Waters on she has an amendment on the Save the Internet Act. So without objection, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, both of you, for being here today. Mr. Lada, is it your understanding that H.R. 1644 would allow the FCC to regulate content on the Internet?
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Lada, is it your understanding, if enacted, could H.R. 1644 raise subscription fees and other costs for American families?
Yes.
And if enacted, could H.R. 1644 expose the data use of American families to taxes and fees that are currently prohibited?
Yes.
And lastly, Mr. Latta, are you concerned that burdensome government regulations could actually slow down innovations and thus slow down the internet, the opposite of the stated goal of this bill?
Yeah, yes, it could.
Thank you.
I would just say none of that is possible under this bill.
Thank you. Ms. Galen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank Representative Doyle, as the Dean of our Pennsylvania delegation, for introducing the Save the Internet Act of 2019 and for his perseverance in bringing this issue forward after it was bottled up in committee during the last Congress, and we were unable to get a hearing or discharge on that. I have heard loud and clear from my constituents that they are firm advocates for this net neutrality bill, and I look forward to seeing it pass into law. In addition to preventing the throttling and the excessive fees, et cetera, it ensures a level playing field for the entrepreneurs, the students, the advocates, and the small businesses that rely on the internet, and guarantees easier access across content providers for everyone. As you noted, Mr. Doyle, it also benefits consumers and corporations by providing certainty and predictability, which is what has been lacking when we've had dueling regimes of rules. So I look forward to seeing this pass. I think it's a great first step towards ensuring a more equitable internet future and a future that respects privacy, autonomy, and access for all of our consumers. And with that, I'll
Thank you
yield
very
back.
much. Mr. Morelli.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, first of all, thank you for taking the roll up, and thanks to Mr. Doyle and Mr. Latta for being here and their hard work. I'll admit to being not particularly tech savvy, so if I ask and these sound ignorant, pardon me, but I'm relatively ignorant on this, I'll agree to it at the beginning. But so the way I sort of see this, and please, Mr. Doyle, to you, just tell me where I'm wrong on this. 25 years ago, the internet, although it was generally, in terms of consumers in its infancy, people used it. I remember used to dial up, you'd hear the modem click, you'd hear the and then eventually, after about a half hour, a screen would be painted and things would come across, and you might have some uses, but generally, it was more a curiosity, maybe a little more than 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago. Now, it seems to me, first of all, obviously there are hundreds of millions of users in the United States alone, that people, aside from streaming videos, use it for medical electronic records, banking, news, information. It's hard to imagine much that doesn't happen in one form or another with the internet. So in some respects, it really has become a public utility. I know people don't like to use the word, but if you think about it, and you think about how much traffic goes over it and the essential uses, it really, in my mind, becomes more like a public utility. But I'm curious about a couple things. First of all, it's been suggested that it stifles competition, but in my mind, the competition that has gone on among ISPs hasn't, so this rule's only been relaxed within the last couple of years. There was plenty of competition prior to the imposition of this and the ending of net neutrality. Is that not true? That ISPs, even under the open rule, prior to the net neutrality rules being relaxed, there was substantial competition among the ISPs.
Yeah, I mean, you have, let me say this, a great swath of America only has a choice of one ISP. Right. That's why it's so important that we have net neutrality rules, because that ISP, and a lot of these ISPs now own content. Comcast owns NBC Universal, AT&T owns Time Warner. So what we don't want to see happen is a ISP which may have a monopoly, may be the only ISP someone has access to, blocking a competitor's content. And so that's the whole genesis behind the idea of these net neutrality rules, to make sure that that middleman, that ISP, gives fair access, equal access to consumers and content providers as they come through.
And I appreciate that, but I guess my point, Howard, was that there's a suggestion that this will block innovation, that somehow having net neutrality rules in place, it will stop innovation. And my argument would be, or I guess my question was, isn't innovation continuing, investments continuing to be made by ISPs even before the rules were relaxed within the last couple of years?
Right after the 2015 internet order was done, an investment actually increased. When these ISPs went to Wall Street and were asked by their investors, what is the impact of this 2015 order on your company's ability to invest money and to expand your services and grow? All of them said this would have absolutely no impact on their decisions to invest money, and they did.
Yeah.
So
That was the point I was at least trying to get your response to. The other thing that, just so I'm clear, when you're a content provider, so think of streaming videos. So you might have, and in my house we have Hulu, we have Netflix, we have Amazon Prime. Those are content providers. Me, as the consumer, can make a judgment based on a whole host of, growing by exponentially content providers to pay a fee for them to stream and to be able to get that information, right?
right.
So when it comes to stifling the content, that's a decision that's made by the consumer. But it occurs to me that if you don't have the rules that you're talking about in place, that if I were, Joe's Videos and I decided I'm going to start a subscription service, that the ISP, if it was paid by one of the large competitors, could essentially say, yeah, Joe's Video, you don't have the resources. We know you want to charge a service. It's very nice. But without the consumer's knowledge, unless I had the ability to compete by giving a fee to the ISP, I would have no recourse here. And the consumer would be blocked in terms of the number of offerings that could potentially be available to them. Is that not right?
Yeah, I mean, both the consumer and the content provider are disadvantaged in that scenario.
Right, because, so fledgling services that are content providers would be damaged pretty dramatically here, and consumers you wouldn't basically know, because those would never get to the point where they have sort of the adequacy in terms of financially, to be able to reach that many consumers. And that, to me, is the end of the day, and I'm not sure what some of the others have said about how this abridges First Amendment rights. It seems to me this encourages expression on the internet and allows more content providers to get to consumers if the consumers want to be. And to your point earlier, as it relates to those areas that only have a single ISP, there is no other to go to. So if they decide that they're going to charge some way, or there's going to be fees put on various content providers, it's not as though you can simply pick up the phone and say, I'd like to change my ISP and have someone else in the area, because there is no other one. And so I'll just conclude, Mr. Chairman, by thanking Mr. Doyle
With
for
all those services you
legislation.
have in your house, you're either more savvy than you're saying, or you've got a lot of kids.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you very much. I got an earful from my constituents about net neutrality, and some of them were pretty sophisticated, but all of them thought that we should go back to the protections that were put in place a few years ago, and they would not be impressed by the fact that they got faster broadband. I certainly haven't been impressed, because it cost me more money when I got faster broadband. They do care about access, though, for rural areas and for kids, and they care a lot about the elements of the earlier FCC rule that really did focus on rural areas and on kids. So the polls show that Americans are in favor of net neutrality, and the kind of net neutrality they expect, some kind of an enforcement provision, some kind of a cop that keeps an eye on it for them. So I strongly support your efforts, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeSagne.
Yeah, I just want to thank Mr. Doyle for bringing this important consumer protection statute to us, and I really do think even the ISPs, this is in their best interest in the long run, and it's been said before, but I really think that we're doing the public a good service, and it's reflected in the surveys that we've heard about. Thank you, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Latta, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate your testimony, and you're free to go. And
Thank the members of the committee.
Mr. Chairman, the ranking member, and members, thanks very much for having us hear the bill
Anything you want
today.
to submit for
Thank
the
you.
record, please leave it with our stenographer. Are there anybody else want to testify on behalf of HR 1644? Seeing none, that closes the hearing portion on HR 1644. We will now consider HR 2021, Investing for the People Act of 2019. We're happy to welcome the Honorable John Yarmouth from Kentucky and the Honorable Steve Womack from Arkansas. Mr. Yarmouth, you may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Cole, members of the committee. Last week, the House Budget Committee passed the Investing for the People Act, a two-year budget that will move our country forward and ensure Congress can meet its obligations to the American people. As chairman of the committee, I'm honored to present this bill to the Rules Committee today in advance of floor action. This bill raises sequestration caps to stop extreme cuts from ever being implemented, corrects years of austerity spending for crucial domestic investments, helps prevent another government shutdown, and provides responsible governing in the face of recklessness. We find ourselves in this position, as we all know, because the Budget Control Act of 2011 used the threat of deep cuts to both defense and non-defense spending levels in order to force an agreement on a wider deficit reduction package. These sequestration caps were designed to be so drastic and so painful that the very threat of their implementation would be enough to spur action. Despite that threat, a deficit reduction package was never enacted. As a result, Congress was forced to come together to raise the caps in 2012, 2013, 2015, and 2018. It is time for us to act again. Those recent bipartisan deals were successful because they were based on the principle of parity. That is, a dollar-for-dollar increase in the caps for both defense and non-defense. The parity principle started with the BCA itself, which divided the sequestration cuts equally between defense and non-defense. H.R. 2021 adheres to this bipartisan principle, allowing us to move forward quickly and responsibly and ensure our appropriators have realistic top lines in place. But even with the 4 bicameral deals I mentioned, non-defense discretionary spending has never fully recovered from years of insufficient funding. NDD currently sits near historic lows at 3.2% of GDP. And if Congress doesn't establish new budget caps this year, it will be cut even further. The Investing for the People Act, which I am honored to have House Appropriations Chairwoman Nita Lowey on as an original co-sponsor, corrects this imbalance. Under our bill, the year-to-year increase for non-defense investments will be twice as large as that for defense spending, which is adjusted only for inflation. The resulting budget levels would mean non-defense funding is fully back to the level in inflation-adjusted terms before the BCA started wreaking havoc on our ability to invest in our communities and our families. This bill soundly rejects the President and congressional Republicans' proposals to blindly boost military spending to $750 billion a year, a level above what the Pentagon said was sufficient to meet the National Defense Strategy. It also rebuffs the President's egregious misuse of the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, which will be capped at no higher than the 2019 levels previously agreed to. Additionally, our bill adheres to the parity principle reflected in the amendment proposed by Senator Murray in the Senate Budget Committee's budget resolution markup last month, and aligns with the bipartisan bicameral cap deals of the past. Passing this two-year budget is both smart and responsible. It provides the Appropriations Committee clear top-line budget levels so they can craft the must-pass legislation needed to fund our government. This will help us avoid a continuing resolution or, at worst, another government shutdown. By passing the Investing for the People Act, we in the House will be doing our jobs, following regular order, and ensuring we can meet the needs and priorities of our families and communities. As the committee considers this legislation, I ask for a structured rule that will allow for meaningful debate. I look forward to passing this bill in the House, and I look forward to taking your questions today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Womack. Welcome.
I thank the chairman, Ranking Member Cole, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to express my concerns about H.R. 2021. I had hoped my friend from Kentucky, and I say that with a high degree of seriousness. He is my friend. I wish we'd have been here to talk about a budget, but we're here on a different matter. The bill we are here to discuss today, by definition, is not a budget, despite what some of my colleagues across the aisle have been suggesting. It does not provide Congress a guide for how to handle spending and revenue decisions. It does not address our nation's rising deficits or the $22 trillion already in debt. It does not offer solutions to prevent Medicare and Social Security from going insolvent. It does not offer a vision for how to put our nation on a fiscally sustainable path and prevent our children and grandchildren from being saddled with record high levels of debt. The only document that can do that is a budget. As you all know, the power of the purse is one of our primary responsibilities under Article 1. That's also why the Budget Committee was created. Without a budget, Congress is flying blind and very likely to exacerbate, not fix, our fiscal problems. However, my colleagues across the aisle have taken a shortcut that focuses on a small portion of the overall budget. I agree with the need to gradually and responsibly raise and extend discretionary spending caps, which have proven to be effective in restraining federal spending and have helped save hundreds of billions of dollars. Unfortunately, this bill is not the answer. It is missing the key ingredients that the last 3 discretionary spending cap increases have had, including bipartisan input, White House participation, and a plan to offset spending. Further, it substantially increases federal spending and it unwinds the progress Republicans in Congress and this administration have made to restore our military readiness and protect our national security. We tried in the Budget Committee to address these issues, but my friends on the other side refused to accept even a single one of our proposed amendments. The Rules Committee has an opportunity to make amendments in order that could improve the situation. Without changes, the bill has no chance of being signed into law, wasting an opportunity to responsibly fund our priorities. Toward that end, I'd like to ask the committee to make in order an amendment that my good friend from Ohio, Congressman Bill Johnson, offered during our markup. The amendment would make this legislation fiscally responsible by requiring mandatory spending reforms equal to or greater than the amount of caps increases in the bill. This proposed change is an important part of governing. We've heard from the Congressional Budget Office in our committee on numerous occasions that the growth of mandatory spending programs is outpacing all of our other spending and driving us further into debt. Interest on the debt will be the size of the defense budget by 2026. If you care about discretionary spending, as I'm sure all of you on this committee do, you should be worried about mandatory spending. I also understand the committee may consider an amendment to add yet another cap adjustment. There are 2 in the bill now which have the effect of disregarding the cap limits the authors are setting. The exercise just makes the point that we should do a budget. We have real opportunities to make these programs better for the people we represent and fix our debt. With a Republican-led White House and Senate, shouldn't we be working together to do just that in the House? So, Mr. Chairman, I strongly oppose this bill in its current form. I hope the committee can see the value of allowing the House to work its will and debate amendments. With that, I thank you for the opportunity to be here today, for the hard work of this committee, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
No, and I thank you both for your testimony. And I would just say, Mr. Womack, I appreciate your testimony. I appreciate the patience that you had sitting through the previous panel. Welcome to the Rules Committee.
Well, I am not sure I learned as much as I should have by sitting there.
But I just want to say for the record, it's just a little bit hard for me, having the last Congress not be so far in the past, to hear kind of a lecture on fiscal discipline. If I remember correctly, my Republican friends passed a tax cut that blew a big hole in our deficit, and by the way, brought it to the Rules Committee under a process where it didn't get a hearing in the Ways and Means Committee. Just came here. My Republican friends were in charge of the House and the Senate and the White House for the last 2 years. So there was opportunities to, in terms of mandatory spending, to have, you had an opportunity when you controlled everything to be able to look at that. I think what we're trying to do here, and I should also say that I do know for a fact that our majority leader has tried to reach out to the White House to have these discussions on increasing discretionary spending, and I think what he's been getting is the kind of get back to me later, get back to me later. I think we need to get our work done in a responsible fashion, but to get it done in a timeline that doesn't mean that we're up against the clock where we risk another government shutdown. We want to get our work done, and so I think that's one of the reasons why we're coming forward with this proposal here today. But I appreciate your being here, Mr. Yarmouth. Thank you for your work, and I have no questions. Mr. Hastings?
I echo the sentiments of the chair and thank Mr. Yarmouth and Mr. Womack.
I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, our ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. These are two of my very favorite members that are here. I mean, Mr. Yarmouth's not only chairman of the powerful Budget Committee, he's chairman of the much more popular and bipartisan Bourbon Caucus. So it's always good to have him here. And my good friend, Mr. Womack, of course, is a fellow appropriator and a dear personal friend. So these are two really quality members. But I want to go back to a point that Mr. Womack made, and I want to put the question directly to the chairman. Is this a budget?
In the sense that it is, it doesn't include revenues, no, it is not a budget. But it is, when you combine it with what the Democratic caucus will be doing, which is first to establish a top-line spending numbers, then the appropriators will do their work, demonstrate our priorities for the American people, and Ways and Means will do whatever it's going to do on revenues. Then we will see in the aggregate a vision of the budget that we would put forward. And I think what is important, we would have loved to have done a budget resolution. The Senate made it very clear to us that they were not going to proceed with the budget resolution, so we could have gone through the exercise and wasted a lot of time and energy to accomplish nothing on our side. As Chairman McGovern expressed, we're trying to move through the process in regular order, have the appropriators do their work, you're part of that process, and then bring appropriations bills to the floor in a timely fashion in June, and therefore make a schedule which will, again, clearly demonstrate Democratic priorities and in a much more timely fashion than it's been done in the past.
But isn't it the responsibility of the Budget Committee to produce a budget? Isn't that in the rules of the House? Regardless of what the Senate does, isn't that in our rules? We're supposed to produce a budget?
That we could have done that. We could have gone through the process and wasted time, and we decided not to waste time.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, I don't suspect you could have done that. I think that was one of the problems, that there was not a consensus on the Democratic side that could produce a budget. Mr. Womack, you were the chairman of this committee last year. Did your committee produce a budget?
We did.
Isn't that required by the rules?
That's precisely why we do a budget, because it is required by the rules, and it is a necessary legislative process in order for us to get to what I believe and what many will share is one of the great single issues facing this country, and that's our fiscal glide path right now.
Well, as an appropriator, I'm intimately familiar with the discretionary budget. How much of federal spending is in the discretionary budget? I'll put that to both of you.
Approximately 1.3 trillion out of 4.4 trillion total spending.
About 30%. So in other words, we're leaving 70% of the federal budget unaddressed by the Budget Committee. No recommendations, no proposals, no insights as to where we should proceed as a country.
That is an accurate statement.
But over 10 years. So this is a real abdication of government. Look, it was our speaker who said, show me your budget and I'll show you your values. Show me your budget. I mean, that ought to come out of at least the Budget Committee. I mean, I will tell you, I was disappointed on our side when we didn't pass a budget through the full House. But this isn't even passing a budget through the Budget Committee.
If I may respond.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman.
There is nothing that prevents us from producing a budget subsequent to this process. What we were trying to do is set timelines. We're having discussions about that now. And but we felt it was imperative upon us to get the top line numbers done, raise the caps, so that the appropriators could work in a reasonable way and move through appropriations process.
Well, as an appropriator, I appreciate that, and I mean that quite sincerely. I will tell you, though, since there's not an agreement with the United States Senate and there's not an agreement with the administration, how we proceed is going to be well and good inside this chamber, but there's no indication at all that what we do is going to become law. Isn't that the case?
That's my opinion.
So, I mean, this is a real abdication of the majority. You were given the majority to govern. Governing means creating a budget that shows your values. You're not doing that here. And so, you know, count me as exceptionally disappointed in that. If we're not going to get a budget resolution, well, and let me ask a different question. Mr. Chairman, you were kind enough, honestly, to have a members' day, and you had a lot of us come in and testify. I actually put forward what has been in the past a bipartisan proposal on Social Security Administration Social Security process reform that would actually go back to something like the old Greenspan Commission, which worked very well. Former Congressman Delaney and I used to carry this together routinely. I was sad that it wasn't in our bills explicitly. I'll just tell you, is there going to be any hearings on any kind of moving forward so we can get the real drivers of the debt out of here? But this will actually be the first budget, the first CAPS proposal, because it's not a budget, but the first CAPS proposal that increases discretionary spending over where it was in fiscal year 2010. So, you know, I understand what you're trying to do there, and I understand, frankly, to some degree, the need for it, although I would argue you're going too far domestically here. By, you know, that's going to make the budget deficit a lot worse than the tax cut over a decade with the proposals you're laying out here, because there's no offsets anywhere, and there's nothing that suggests it'll stimulate economic growth, which at least there's an argument on the tax cut.
Well, to answer your last point first, this is a 2-year budget. This is not a 10-year budget. This is a 2-year spending level. So you cannot say that this is going to proceed over 10 years. And
Do you think we'll cut discretionary budget 2 years from now?
I don't know what we'll do, but this is only for 2 years. And I will say that the ranking member and I spent the entire last year as part of the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Reform, trying to figure out a way we could make this process more sensible, more efficient, and more effective. And at the end of the process, the ranking member and I were 2 of the only members who voted for some proposals to actually proceed. So we have a common interest that exists still in working on budget reform, and we plan to proceed with consideration of ideas that hopefully will make the process better.
I appreciated that, and I followed your work last year and was very pleased to see both of you working, and it actually gave me some hope going forward this year that we could find some ground there. But, you know, I would submit to you the problem here, you know, in terms of the budget being unbalanced, isn't the discretionary budget. It has not been for a decade. We have lived within the numbers we've been given. Those numbers actually have been lower until this year, until this proposal. If you look at defense and OCO funding, and I think they're 2 sides, I actually agree with your point on that. They're basically 2 sides of the same coin. We shouldn't be using OCO as a gimmick, which I do think in the president's budget they do, to protect defense spending. But those 2 numbers combined were lower in fiscal year 2019 than they were in fiscal year 2010. And non-defense discretionary was lower in 2019, the current year that we're in, than in 2010. So our problem isn't the appropriation side of this. Our problem is the unwillingness of both parties, both sides of the rotunda, and both of the last 2 administrations to sit down and deal seriously with entitlement spending. And that doesn't necessarily mean entitlement cuts. It may mean more revenue. That's exactly what they did in 1983 under the proposal I offered you. They made some modest reforms. They increased the age of Social Security. They did some things that were on that side of the issue, but they also increased the amount of money, income that was subject to taxation. That's the kind of deal we got to have. And I'm sad that we're not working on something like that here.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a comment in reference to what he just said?
Yeah, he's got the time, yeah.
If he would be willing to yield the time. And the CBO analysis that came out earlier this year, as I said in my opening, the issue that we face is on the mandatory side. It's not the discretionary, even though the caps issue is what we're debating here today. But as a percentage of GDP, mandatory spending is going higher. And as a percentage of GDP, discretionary spending is tracking lower. And so we have a real problem there, and I think CBO has been good to point that out, and why we are not doing a budget that can actually get to that side of the ledger is what the argument is about today.
Well, I agree with that. Let me ask you one more unrelated issue, but I know it's something I hope you feel strongly about. I know my friend does. One of the other proposals I made, and I'll probably try and present an amendment here tonight, was to forward fund the Indian Health Service, which requires, some sort of approval from the Budget Committee. Is that an issue? I know it's not addressed, obviously, in this. I wish it were, because we've had that community subject to when we've had government shutdowns, subject to being disrupted, their health care, which is actually a treaty obligation. We do this with veterans now. It's the right thing to do, that we keep this obligation. Is there any opposition to doing something like that going forward?
I'm not sure. I've met with representatives of many of the Native American tribes to discuss the problem. I'm very sympathetic to the issue that they raised. The concern we have is that there are many programs that during the shutdown suffered dramatically, and that we have to consider the precedent that's set. I think our primary obligation ought to be, as a Congress, and to the extent that we can impact the administration, is to avoid shutdowns and to proceed through regular order so that these issues don't arise.
Couldn't agree with you more. I've condemned them, and my own side has participated in them. And I've always voted to reopen the government as quickly as I possibly could. But in this case, Chairman, just to make the point for the record, since we're having this discussion, nobody else's health care is impacted by discretionary spending. Every other group of Americans don't have their Medicaid or their Medicare interrupted. For some reason, only American natives seem to be subject. I've had this discussion just as sternly with your predecessors on this same issue. And the bill that I'm supporting is actually a Democratic bill. It's by our good colleague, Representative McCullum, who's a leader on these issues. So I would just ask you, when you get back to it, don't decide for some arcane budget reason that somehow Indians have to be subjected to discretionary spending limits on their health care when no other American is. Just the wrong thing to do.
Thank you. I'm in great sympathy with you.
I appreciate that. My friend, care to make a comment?
No, I'll leave it there.
Okay, that's a good place to leave it. Let me just end with this, and I really want to encourage you both to write a budget and get it out of your budget committee. It may or may not survive the House. We had that experience last year. I'm disappointed in that, but I think it's important for the institution, to not let the immediate, overwhelm the important. And what's important is long-term, setting us on some path that starts moving us down. And I would look at some of these things that can be bipartisan. Mr. Delaney in my bill was very bipartisan. It didn't dictate the outcome. It just said Congress would end up voting on a solution. Social Security is the easiest place to start because it's a math problem. Medicare and Medicaid, I would concede to anybody, are much tougher issues as to how we do it. But we certainly can make sure Social Security is fully funded so we don't hit a cliff out there in 2030. And I think you would find, and I've had this very same discussion with the President of the United States, you'll find it's a political winner to save Social Security. When Ronald Reagan did it and Tip O'Neill did it, working together in 1983, Ronald Reagan won 49 states the next year, and Tip O'Neill stayed Speaker of the House. It's something, why we politicize, it's something all Americans want to see us come together, and I hope you'll put together a budget that lays out those kind of practical and bipartisan approaches. And again, I will tell you, I had trouble with my own side on this too, so I'm not trying to be partisan in this, but that discussion has to happen. We miss an opportunity here when we don't present a real budget. We produce spending caps that are really, frankly, being adjusted to sort of satisfy different groups within our various constituencies. We do it with defense, you do it with non-defense, and that's what we're seeing here. But we're not seeing a real discussion about where the country ought to go fiscally in the next few years. And I would also submit, last point, time to do it is now. The best time to actually get entitlement reform is in divided government. That's how we got it in '83. We had divided government in both sides. So please take advantage of a rare opportunity and lay out a challenge, and let's see if people will respond to it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. They just called votes, but we'll try to get through this panel if we could. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. I want to follow some of what has been said and encourage you to continue working together on some common practices on how we can improve our budgeting process. Having served in California, we had a $15 billion deficit, and we had to cut a third of our budget spending. That was a crisis, and I would not wish that on my worst enemy to have to deal with. So ensuring that when we allow the administration to send our military into foreign lands and to fight undeclared wars, there's a cost associated with that, and we have to deal with it not only at what does it cost to send people there, but what does it cost to recover their lives once they come back? And I think that those, some of those very common sense issues need to be addressed for the long term. I also agree that budgeting shows our values. What do we care about the most, from the national perspective? And with that, in February, we received the president's budget. The president's budget would keep us from meeting the basic needs of Americans across the nation. It would mean draconian cuts to critical programs. Over the next decade, this budget would cut Social Security by $25 billion. I care a lot about our Native American community and how they're treated, but I also care a lot about how seniors are treated. And when seniors in my community hear that this is going to be a cut, to a program that they depend on, it is a cause for alarms. And that's when the calls come in, and that's when people show that they're very, very concerned and they're paying attention to what we're doing. This budget proposes cutting $845 billion from Medicare, $1.5 trillion from Medicaid over 10 years. It also, it's also a direct assault on women's health. Experts say the Title X program should be funded to the tune of $400 million to serve some of the most basic reproductive health needs of very low-income women. The president's budget would only give $286.5 million to that program that is already underfunded. I want to make sure that we work the numbers and that we make ends meet and that we try to live within our needs. But I also want to make sure that the first people we don't throw off the ship are the seniors and women and children. These are vulnerable populations that we need to help them. So, what my colleagues on the other side say when it comes to dealing with the president's budget, you refer to it as fiscal responsibility. Fiscal responsibility for whom? After you just passed the $1.5 trillion tax cut that will grow our deficit and rob the future of our children and rob the present of our seniors. HR 2021 will allow us to make the investments that we need to address the basic needs of the American people. I look forward to supporting HR 2021, the Investing for the People Act of 2019. I wonder if you can discuss the impact of the timely passage of this legislation on the appropriations process.
Well, thank you very much for the question, and I totally agree with your assessment of the president's budget. Enormous cuts in health care, $230 billion in cuts in SNAP, $209 billion in cuts to student aid, $4.5 billion in cuts to the National Institutes of Health. I mean, incredible investments in both our human and future potential. But what we're trying to do here, once again, is to pass what we believe are appropriate spending levels to do the job that the American people expect of us. So when we talk about non-defense spending, the president's budget would have cut non-defense spending by more than 10%. And cuts, as I've mentioned, but cuts in 30% at EPA, 20% in State Department, some incredibly important investments that are not just in our families and our communities, but in our national security. Because remember, non-defense discretionary spending includes Homeland Security, it includes the FBI, includes the FDA, it includes the FAA, includes transportation spending, all investments that are critically important to our economic and national security. So we believe the spending levels that we're proposing in both defense and non-defense discretionary spending are the levels at which the appropriators can make the kind of investments in our human security, in our national security, and our economic security that will put the country on a good path to providing the kind of society that we aspire to.
Did you have anything to add?
Well, it's not for me to litigate in this hearing the president's budget necessarily. I'm trying to make an Article I case here tonight. I'm not trying to either say what I like or don't like about the president's budget. I'm simply here to say that what we have before you in 2021 is not a budget. And for the Budget Committee to actually do its work, we have to produce a budget resolution and give a full vetting to the issues that face our country. These are very deep and critical issues that we all know have to be addressed. But by not doing a budget resolution, by just simply raising the caps on discretionary spending about a third of government and kicking the can down the road on the others is exactly why we're in the condition we're in and why we will stay in this condition and exacerbate the condition without a budget resolution.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the privilege of serving with Mr. Morelli on the Budget Committee with these two fine folks. I know the chairman can only do what the Democratic caucus permits him to do. I will tell you that it would be a terrible mistake not to let these two gentlemen try to craft a budget together. Not that Republicans were always the best role models for how to reach across the aisle and pass bipartisan budgets, but I saw the bipartisan and bicameral consensus you built on the Joint Committee last year, and it will go down in history as a terrible missed opportunity if we don't empower you both to try to do that same thing with a budget this year.
Thank you. You're a role model in this committee right now. Right to the point. Mr. Perlmutter.
Yeah, just a quick point. Signed to your committee and appropriations is a bill I've got, H.R. 1280, No More Government Shutdown Act, which, obviously we've all run into. In my career, I think we're at 5 shutdowns, and I want to avoid it. It just continues the prior year's appropriations for the next year until you either get a budget, you do the spending caps, or our appropriators come to terms with the White House. So I hope to see you all in the Budget Committee since this has been assigned to you and to Mr. Cole. See you.
Thank you. And I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the testimony of Maxine Waters on an amendment she has to this bill. Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to both of our witnesses for being here this evening. Let me just ask you a question, Mr. Womack, about the part of the budget that is outside of, or the part of our spending that is outside of our appropriation process, the mandatory side of the ledger. And it has grown significantly over the time that I've been here. Is there a way to realistically dial that back so that we do reclaim some of our Article I authority and actually budget for the money that is spent?
Well, it's moving away from us. The key word in your question is realistically, and whenever you're dealing with something from a realistic standpoint, you also have to introduce the political dynamics that go into that. The short answer to your question, Dr. Burgess, is absolutely. If we can find the will to understand that if we continue down the path we're on, both of the major programs on the mandatory side of ledger get cut. I mean, we've all read the trustees' reports and the analyses.
That was going to be the follow-on part of
They-
my question.
they-
There is a day on the Medicare Trust Fund and the Social Security Trust Fund when those trust funds are exhausted. Is that not correct?
2026 on Medicare Part A and 2030, pick a number, 2032, 33 in that time frame on Social Security. These are very concerning, and I know my counterpart, the chairman here, shares those concerns. And that's why we need to have a budget resolution that can, in a very serious way, explain the truth on the balance sheet to the American people.
So when that day dawns, whether or not we've done anything to reclaim any portion of the mandatory spending, something will happen, and it will be a reduction in the outlays that are paid for people who are receiving dollars from those programs. Is that correct?
It will either be very serious, very draconian cuts to those programs, which we can forecast now by year, or it will take the Congress of the United States to decide to limit the downside on those cuts with some other type of enhancement. But yes, that would happen.
And I'll just never forget a lecture I heard from a senator from Massachusetts, Senator Tsongas, back in 1993, when he came and talked to the Dallas Business Group on health and talked about entitlement spending and was concerned that the present trajectory that was available to him in 1993, that there would reach a point where a subsequent generation of Americans, probably not yet born, would make the determination that it is not worth continuing the type of taxation levels they are enduring to continue those benefits for the people who are now seeing the rollback after the exhaustion of the trust funds. In other words, it's baked into the cake that there's going to be an intergenerational conflict. And the sad thing is we know the timeline. And we may not know all the participants because they haven't been born yet, but we can forecast just what Senator Tsongas was warning us about down in Dallas, Texas that day. We can forecast it. In fact, it is on the future.
Dr. Burgess, years ago, we could forecast it somewhat by time, almost exact time, just based on analysis. But back then, the day of reckoning was so far off, we knew that we had some time to fix it. But I think anybody on this panel would agree that 2026 is right around the corner, and 2032 or 33 on the Social Security side is not far behind it. So yes, they are imminent.
Let me ask you another question that's a little harder, because the third component of that, what we normally consider the big three in the mandatory spending.
The interest.
Well, no, actually, I wasn't considering that, but Medicaid is not backed up by trust fund. Interest is not backed up by trust fund. So Medicaid, not backed up by a trust fund, there is no normal forecastable pause point in Medicaid spending as there is for Social Security and Medicare. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So that will continue to be a high-pressure tap on the federal treasury. And I don't see the political will in this Congress, last Congress, next Congress to deal with that, but deal with it we must at some point. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
So to find a different approach, a new paradigm, I mean, this is one of the things that seems to be incumbent upon us, is it not?
It is incumbent, and that's why I suggest that we need to have a very good adult conversation with our country about what we expect out of our nation, our ability to finance it. And when I was a mayor, I used to say we need to address and separate the needs from the wants. And we have some real issues facing us right now, and they are becoming quicker in fruition.
Well, my apologies for leaving interest on the national debt out of that equation, but you're right, that
Well,
is a substantial.
neither one of us leave interest on the national debt out of the equation because it is growing, and if we ever normalize these interest rates, we're in really big trouble.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yield back.
So the time on the vote has expired. We have about 120 who haven't voted yet. 98 haven't voted. Does anyone here have any questions that they need? What? Ms. Lesko, it's up to you. Whether these guys come back or not.
No pressure at all.
Yeah.
I'll try to be quick. You know, a couple times here, I heard my friends on the other side of the aisle talk about the tax cuts. And so, Mr. Womack, I want to take a few minutes to focus on revenues. I understand that the 50-year average of revenue is 17.4% of GDP. And even with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the CBO estimates revenue for 2020 through 2029 to average 17.5%. So it's in line with the historical average. Been told that we have record high revenues. So my question is, many on our Democratic friends blame the passage of the tax law as the reason for soaring deficit and debt. Do you agree with that assessment?
No, I don't. I think it's very premature to make a declaration like that because we're only in year number 2 of that tax cut, and I don't think there's any question it has produced the kind of climate right now on which our job creators can really expand their businesses, create jobs and opportunities, and we have millions of jobs right now left unfilled. So I personally think it is working, but I don't think it is should be by itself in the discussion. I think regulatory reform and some of the other issues that we address outside of the budget framework are critical to revenues.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Womack. I also understand that there is cutting of $44 billion below what the president wants on military spending, and that there was some kind of disagreement between the Democrats in committee of how much to cut, that some of the more progressives wanted more to cut. And so what did you do? Are you concerned about the cuts in military spending?
Well, I'm a defense appropriator, and I'm privy to a lot of things and I'm a 30-year veteran, so military spending is pretty important to me. And I'm also, I recognize the great threats around the globe, so, but we did, in the CAPS deal, I think we settled at
$733 billion, which is $17 billion less than the president's request, $17 billion more than current spending levels.
Thank you, sirs.
All right, thank you very much. You don't have to come back. And I want to thank everybody in the committee for
Thank you, Mr.
making that
Chairman.
possible. And we are going to temporarily recess until Mr. Scott comes back up, and then, yeah, so if you haven't voted, vote, and then come right back up, and then we're going to just try to get him going, and Mr. Woodall can take over. No. So we recess until Mr. Scott comes back.
Can't find my.
She's looking for a card.
I don't want to miss it either.
Kelly, are they just bouncing back and forth?
Rules Committee will reconvene. We're now happy to call our next witness, Mr. Scott. Thank you for your patience, and go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After an hour and a half in those chairs, the rest of the week should be a breeze. I would suggest if you need a shorter committee time, swap the chairs.
Yeah, we don't have any time limits up here.
As you remember, Mr. Chairman, you worked very closely with myself and with Congressman Bishop on disaster relief a couple of months ago. Several storms hit the United States in 2018. The latest was Hurricane Michael that straddled my district and Congressman Bishop's district. I have spoken several times on this, and let me say this. I think every member of this committee has been supportive of what we've tried to do in passing a disaster bill. And this amendment is simple. It adds H.R. 268, the House-passed disaster assistance bill, to your current legislation, simply adds it to the end of it. Very quickly, one of the things that has not been talked about much recently is the fact that the Air Force has used virtually all of their operations and maintenance money for the remainder of the fiscal year. And if they do not get something before we leave for the break, they are going to find themselves in dire straits. There is $750 million in this language for Puerto Rico. That is $600 million for food stamps. And in addition to that, on page 56 in the amendment, you will see the $150 million that was added in the House version of the bill. It is, with the exception of a couple of amendments, it is identical to what we passed.
And I appreciate you being here, and I certainly am sympathetic to your case here, and I know how your constituents have been impacted and how this is important because you have raised that issue to us directly. And in the disaster relief package that we passed the House, your priorities were reflected in that. And so I hope we can figure out a way to get this thing resolved because there are a lot of people in this country that are relying on us to get this right. So I appreciate you being here. Ms. Torres? Mr. Woodall?
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Scott talks about this nonstop, fights for this nonstop. Every meeting I'm in with him, because his constituents and Sanford Bishop's constituents have put their hopes in the process working, and candidly, those hopes have been repaid with disappointment over this time under both Republican leadership and now Democratic leadership. I understand, as I know the gentleman from Georgia does, that there are waivers that would be required to make this in order, but I don't believe we'll find a man or a woman on the floor of the House that doesn't want to see families affected by typhoons, by wildfires, by volcanic activity, by hurricanes, know that the government has their back in this way. So I know it's unusual for us to offer a waiver of the magnitude that the gentleman from Georgia needs, but he's knocked on every single door on our side of the hill, on the other side of the hill, to knock on. And we're the last hope of these families that stretch from Georgia to Puerto Rico, from Florida to California. And I hope we don't let them down tonight.
Mr. Perlmutter?
Thanks for your persistence. I pass.
Mr. Raskin? Mr. Scanlon? Mr. Morelli? Mr. Shalala? Mr. DeSagne? Yeah, again, I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Woodall. I mean, I think you have been steadfast in your advocacy and on this issue, and we need to resolve this one way or the other. And so I thank you for your patience. I thank you for waiting here, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your support in the prior meeting as well.
Thank you. And are there any other members who wish to testify in this legislation? Seeing none, this closes the hearing portion of our meeting. So I think that we're going to reconvene after the next vote, right? The last vote. We don't know how many votes we have. After the last vote, and I think we should be ready to report the rule out at that point. So we will recess subject to the call of the chair.
They're taking another quick break to go finish the last vote, which they were doing, and then coming back. So they, yeah, these are just, I think it's like what the actual process is. It goes for like, some votes are, under suspension, so it's like, so the bill, the votes that they're taking now are just under suspension, right? So they're just. Global Water Protection Act. Yeah. Right, so these ones, they just, they know. They go for 2 minutes.
But they're not contentious, and everybody knows what you're going to say about that. But they need to vote.
So they'll go for like, the vote and come back,
So what happened when we reconvene them? And they've got to vote on these amendments? Right, which are all
He's got it down.
But I understand. Yeah. See, this is what.
No, I know what you're saying. Yeah, oh, totally. I hear you.
Something else could be possible.
I mean, I guess you've been around long enough, and there's times when certainly there's things that happen that are surprising that don't go.
But it was saying about what's the point if you know just Trump's just similar, they get similar comments about saying, no, that's all they did. Right. And you gotta have some ability to regulate to say that you can't just give the ISPs the authority to do whatever they want for their own purposes, especially if they're monopolies because of consolidation. So, just keep looking the same points, nobody's listening.
Yeah.
And everybody's going to do what they're going to do, and just like we do anything else, so everything's prepared.
Okay. Ready? You got Morelli? Okay, ready? The Rules Committee will come to order. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee report a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 1644, the Save the Internet Act of 2019. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes an order as original text for the purpose of amendment, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-10 and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes an order only those amendments printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part A of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instruction. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 2021, the Investing for the People Act of 2019, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Budget. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes in order as original text for the purpose of amendment, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-11, provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule provides that House Resolution 293 is hereby adopted. The rule provides that on any legislative day during the period from April 11, 2019 through April 26, 2019, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. The rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 4 of the resolution. The rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 4 of the resolution shall not constitute a calendar day for purposes of Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution. The rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 4 of the resolution shall not constitute a legislative day for purposes of Clause 7 of Rule 13.
So as we just heard from the gentleman from New York, this rule provides for consideration of H.R. 1644, the Save the Internet Act of 2019, under a structured rule, which makes in order 12 amendments. The rule also provides for consideration of H.R. 2021, the Investing for the People Act of 2019, under a structured rule, which makes in order 3 amendments. The rule also deems as passed House Resolution 293, which will immediately put in place an enforceable top-line discretionary spending level so that the Appropriations Committee can begin its work. Finally, the rule provides standard recess instructions through April 26. So you've heard the motion from the gentleman from New York. Is there any amendment or discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cole.
I have a number of amendments, but I have an amendment at the desk.
Okay.
I'd like to call up and make an order to the rule. Amendment number 13, offered by Mr. Mullen of Oklahoma. I won't spend a lot of time on this. This relates to the Indian health issue that we had quite a discussion on. But I also would like to attach, I sent a letter with 59 members from both sides of the aisle, including Democratic and Republican members of the Budget Committee, to ask that this be made in order. Again, this is exceptionally bipartisan. It's an issue of fairness. Every other part of the population is covered by mandatory health care programs. Only the Indian Health Care Service is under discretionary. And as my good friend from Colorado pointed out, we've had 5 government shutdowns, and each one of those have negatively impacted the Indian Health Service. I can tell you my own tribe, which is fortunate enough to be successful We actually keep 6 months of reserves out of our own funds to cover for these things when they happen. Unfortunately, if you live at Pine Ridge or you live at Rosebud or any of the number, they don't have that ability. And they immediately, you're talking about laying off nurses, you're talking about doctors not being paid, you're talking about medical supplies not happening. So this is something I think we can do in a bipartisan manner, and I'd like to move to make it in order here.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman's amendment. I just say that I am very sympathetic, and I certainly support, the bill that the gentleman is referenced earlier, the McCullen bill. I think there's an issue about whether this is the appropriate place to attach it. We can argue about that, but I pledge to work with the gentleman and to try to, I think others on our side too, to work with the Budget Committee to try to find a way to bring this up in a bipartisan way, because I think it is an important issue, and the gentleman has been steadfast in his advocacy on this. So I'm going to reluctantly urge a no vote, but I appreciate the gentleman's amendment. Any other discussion or comments? Hearing none, the vote is on the amendment by Mr. Cole. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Murley. Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole.
Yes.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall.
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko.
Aye.
Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Very reluctantly, no.
Mr. Chairman, no.
The clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to H.R. 1644, the rule to make an order and provide necessary waivers for amendment number 17, actually offered by Ms. Horn of Oklahoma, Democratic amendment that would initiate a review the challenges for rural broadband providers in serving hard-to-reach areas. The amendment identifies challenges for rural broadband providers, specifically those designated to be serving high-cost areas by the Federal Communications Commission to maintain and upgrade and to expand their networks in the evolving internet ecosystem. I want to thank my friend in my own delegation, but on the other side of the aisle, for offering this amendment. I think it's an important one, represent a lot of areas like this.
We've heard you've heard the amendment from Mr. Cole. Is there any discussion? Hearing
Yes.
none? Oh, yeah, Mr. Lesko.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I too support this motion because I believe that the availability and sustainability of rural broadband networks is very important.
Any other discussion? Hearing none, the vote will be on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Roll call. Clerk will report. Call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Murley. No. Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala. No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier. No. Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole.
Yes.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall.
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess.
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko.
Aye.
Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to offer a motion to make an order, amendment number 11 by Representative Walden. To reiterate, in our view, we all agree on net neutrality rules to protect free and open internet for consumers, specifically no blocking and no throttling. Although we may disagree on policy specifics, there are real issues with this bill, and this amendment addresses many of the areas of concern for Republicans. Let me be clear, in our view, H.R. 1644 is not net neutrality. The amendment certainly deserves a fair and open debate on the House floor for an opportunity to work toward a bipartisan compromise rather than scoring political points with a deeply partisan bill.
We've heard the amendment from Mr. Cole. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, the vote will be on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it.
Roll call, please.
Clerk, a roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Mrs. Torres. No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Murley. No. Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala. No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier. No. Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall.
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko.
Aye.
Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 6
Amendment is
nays.
not agreed to. Further amendments, Mr. Cole.
One last amendment. You know we couldn't let you get away with it without trying to strike Section 3 of the rule. Democrats are clearly divided on this issue, and they have to include one of the main provisions of H.R. 2021 in the rule and self-execute it. This is eerily reminiscent of the same process Democrats used to pass Obamacare. The rule should exist to govern the terms of debate, not ram through legislation that does not command a majority support.
Yeah, you've heard the Cole Amendment. Any discussion? I just want to say one thing. We just endured a 35-day government shutdown, the longest shutdown in history. And in this committee, we are committed to doing everything in our power to prevent another damaging shutdown. So we want to make sure we can move forward with appropriations legislation, and this provision is a safety net to ensure that process can begin. My Majority Leader Hoyer said that the budget is a possible item for consideration on the House floor this week. Whenever it comes up, we will have the path forward, but that is why we're doing it. So the vote will be on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Being chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Murley.
No.
Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala.
No.
Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Desagne. No. Mr. Desagne, no. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall. Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko. Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman,
Clerk,
no.
report the total.
4 yeas, 6
Amendment
nays.
is not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Woodall.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we make the rule an open rule for H.R. 1644 and H.R. 2021. We've been here almost 3 hours, just the 13 of us, to talk about amendments. I recognize the
We have
value,
no time limits.
recognize the value of a pre-printing requirement, but at this late date, we can't do that
Okay.
either. So I move for an open rule so that some of what we've had here can be.
You've heard the Woodall Amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Being chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Murley. Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Desagne. Mr. Desagne, no. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall.
Aye.
Mr. Wood, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments, Mr. Woodall.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule that would make an order and provide the necessary waivers to amendment number 9 to H.R. 2021 offered by Mr. Scott of Georgia. You heard his presentation. This is the only train leaving the station to provide for disaster relief from coast to coast in this country. Those folks have been waiting too long, and they deserve a vote on the House floor.
You've heard the Woodall Amendment. Any discussion? I just say that there is a rumor the Senate may act on this week. If it does, then we can go to conference, which is probably more efficient and direct way to be able to resolve this issue, so we can get a bill passed by both chambers into the president's desk. So I will recommend a no. All those in favor of the Woodall Amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Being the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Murley.
No.
Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala.
No.
Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Desagne. Mr. Desagne, no. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall.
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule to make an order, amendment number 6, offered by Mr. Womack of Arkansas, Mr. Johnston of Ohio. 3 bills which raised the caps in 2013, 2015, and 2018, all included mandatory offsets. There was at that time bipartisan consensus that additional discretionary spending should be paid for by reducing mandatory spending. This amendment just continues that policy by making any increases to discretionary spending caps contingent on enactment of mandatory spending reductions that are equal to or greater to the total increase of the discretionary spending caps. And I urge support of the amendment and its inclusion in our debate tomorrow.
I thank the gentleman for his amendment, and I also want to thank him for working with us to revise the amendment he offered so that we can make it in order. The Burgess Amendment is number 1. That's how much we...
Always number 1.
Right, absolutely. But I will recommend a no on the amendment that you just offered. Any other discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Being your chair, the noes have it. We'll have a roll call vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Mrs. Torres. No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Murley. No. Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala. No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Desanier? Mr. Desanier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Whittle? Mr. Whittle, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
Members not agreed to. Any further amendments? Ms. Lesko.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule to make an order and grant the necessary waivers to amendment number 1 offered by Mr. Biggs and myself. It recognizes that the national debt is a threat to our national security.
You've heard the Lesko amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Lesko amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. You want to ask a roll call?
Yes, roll call.
Roll call is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Murley? Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala? No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Desanier? Mr. Desanier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Whittle? Mr. Whittle, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko?
Aye.
Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
Members not agreed to. Further amendments. Ms. Lesko.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment to the rule to make an order and provide the necessary waivers for amendment number 10 offered by Mr. Norman of South Carolina. This amendment would require Congress to take a vote on the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution later this year.
You've heard the amendment from the gentlewoman. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Lesko amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. You want a roll call?
Yes.
Okay. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Murley? Mr. Murley, no. Ms. Shalala? No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. Desanier? Mr. Desanier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Whittle? Mr. Whittle, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
Is there any other amendment or discussion? Hearing none, the question is now on the motion offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli. All those in favor will say aye. 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 All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Roll call has been requested.
Mr. Hastings? Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Murley? Mr. Murley, aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. Desanier? Mr. Desanier, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Whittle? Mr. Whittle, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
6 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and accordingly, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, who's also a member of the Budget Committee, will be handling this for us on the floor. And I thank everybody for their patience and apologize for the delay, and that concludes the hearing, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.